Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining me, astrologer Patrick Arundell, for the latest of my deep dive videos. Today I'm going to explore the mighty Saturn's retrograde, which begins in the sign of Pisces on the 17th of June and goes through to the 4th of November. Now, the first 10 degrees of each zodiac sign, the first decan, has a particular ruling planet, and Pisces is Neptune. And Neptune is a particularly mystical, dreamy, and rather ephemeral influence, which is intriguing because Saturn is pretty well the converse. It's very much about structures. So how will they cohabit with Saturn's retrograde in process? Also, whenever an event begins, just like the start of anything, our own lives or any new institution, we have an event chart. So what does the event chart tell us? Saturn is forging a really important relationship to Mercury, but also we need to consider that Saturn is the domiciliary ruler of the sign of Capricorn. So what's going on with Capricorn? We have Pluto there at the moment. Of course, we also have Neptune currently located in Pisces. So what's Neptune doing? We need to be aware of that. And the co-regent of the sign of Pisces, the traditional ruler, is Jupiter. And ironically, Jupiter is in an influence with Saturn. So I need to just go through all of those influences for you. But then I'm going to share an insight of what we can expect for each of the 12 zodiac signs. Now, Saturn can be very much about harsh lessons, but it can offer opportunities, and I want to share what those opportunities can be for your sign and for us all if we apply ourselves, which is what Saturn is very much about. If you're new to this channel, thank you so much for joining us. This is very much a community. If you do share any thoughts, I try to interact with each comment. But most of all, I do work so hard at these videos, so I would be very grateful if you would subscribe. Please click or tap on the bell notification symbol. If you're a returning visitor, it's great to have you with me again. Now, I do a free written daily horoscope with an overview for that day, which you can subscribe to and get to your device each morning. Please see the link beneath this video. So let's just look at the technical stuff first of all. So when Saturn moved into the sign of Pisces on the 7th of March, it was the first time for around about 28 years. And the sign of Pisces is the culmination of the zodiacal path or story, if you like, which essentially means the journey of the animal. So when the sun starts out at 0 degrees Aries on the vernal point, each spring equinox, it terminates at the end of the year in the sign of Pisces. So Pisces energy for Saturn is a big deal. You know, if we think back, the whole cycle of Saturn is 29.5 years, and Saturn goes retrograde each time. It goes through each sign 3 times, and this is the first in Pisces. So if we think of that whole pattern, we go back to 29.5 years ago in total, but because we're just starting the journey, the transit of Saturn through Pisces, we're at the start of that process. So Saturn can be about those harsh lessons. But did you know in Greek mythology, Saturn was known as Kronos, as in the word chronology, so timepieces. So it is the lord of time in traditional astrology. So Saturn very much is the pattern of our life. And it's incredible, you know, how often life does get divided up into slots of around about 7, 14, 21 and 28 years. But then you may be thinking, but hold on, Patrick, if Saturn takes 29.5 years to go through its cycle, how do you get to 28? Well, it's because of the lunar cycle, which takes 27.5 years. So if we join the two together and divide them by 2, we kind of get around about 7.25, 7.5, just over 14.5, and so forth, that big events happen. And it's quite metronomic how this seems to play out in many people's lives. You know, they'll leave a job, a relationship, and sometimes it can be 3.5 years that things come, or even 1.75 years. So that's where Saturn is coming into an angle which triggers a big event. So Saturn moved into Pisces on the 7th of March. And because Saturn is very much about time, it's also the last planet that we can physically see with our eyes. So we don't really know what goes on beyond Saturn unless we fish out a telescope. Now, Pisces, in another way, is also something that's rather imperceptible, because there's a sense of mystery to this sign. It's very much to do with what's unstructured in paradox to Saturn. You know, it doesn't really have boundaries. It is quite timeless. So the two are essentially quite incompatible. So what Saturn is asking us to do through its journey in the sign of Pisces over the next couple of years is become much more attuned to the spiritual, emotional and psychological spheres. But Saturn requires us to work at these areas and not ignore them. Saturn can be a very cold influence, of course. So it could be that people who tend to have rather a detached approach to their emotional health are the people who have the greatest lessons to learn. A lot of people who are interested in personal development, like astrology, are actually very attuned to grow in and evolve in. But if it's something that, you know, the emotional sphere is something that, in the way that you've been brought up, is something that's rather unspoken about, I think Saturn can be very useful in reading books, becoming more informed, and trying to break how we are, that shadow side of our natures that we all have, break down how we are and how we respond to situations in a way which gives us a greater sense of understanding. Because one of the things with Pisces is it can be about avoiding responsibility. It can be where we need to be much more disciplined. You know, it can be where we need to put boundaries in, particularly if we lack a little bit of discipline, especially around things like escapism. It's also because a water sign where we could purify different elements of our approach, but also dissolve the things that aren't working anymore. But, you know, if there is anything that we have an addiction around, I think Saturn's retrograde can really ask us to double down on working on finding the solutions for our responses that may be triggered more when we're under pressure, feeling unhappy, feeling dissatisfied. And of course, Saturn is the planet of tough love, so it's not always going to make life easy for us. Also, I thought it was quite interesting in terms of the dams. We've had 2 dams that have now been blown up in the Ukraine. And if we think that Saturn is very much about restraint, boundaries and structures, and Pisces is very much about water, it's interesting that the ingress from the dams, now they've been blown up, creates a breach of that structure. And it just so happened when the Kakhovka dam was blown up by the Russians, that on that day Mars, the planet of anger and war, was actually in a tense angle to Saturn in Pisces. Now, astrology doesn't make anyone do things, but it is interesting how the timing very often will correlate with what's going on in the heavens. As above, so below. So when this event begins, I think the really fascinating thing to see is that Saturn itself is in a very tense angle with Mercury. And Mercury is very much to do with communication. And I'm just sharing on the screen now the event chart from a solar perspective. starting at 0 degrees Aries. So this is a chart we can all relate to. This is almost like how it's going to feel for us all collectively. And you can see that Saturn is at 7 degrees and 12 minutes. It's in the first decan of the sign of Pisces. That's the first 10 degrees. So in itself, very spiritual, but very difficult to grapple with when we have the energy of Saturn, which wants, if you like, cold, hard facts, when that more dissolving energies of Neptune makes that more difficult to get to grips with. But it's there in house 12. Hidden enemies in traditional astrology, secrets, things we don't want to look at. And Mercury is domiciled in its home zone of Gemini, or one of its two home zones, in the third house. So one of the things that's going to happen over the next 20 weeks, next 38% of the year, is we are going to see a lot of secrets around communications coming into the open. And because Saturn can be about suppressing, especially where power is linked to it in not a positive way, so there may be some prominent people who have had conversations, they may have had emails or text messages that they've shared, they may actually have documents that prove that they were up to no good. And I think that the square with Mercury can tease these out into the open. Now, we also need to look at the two rulers of the sign of Pisces, and guess what? Neptune, very influential in the first decan of the sign of Pisces, is in a square with the Sun, like Mercury, in house 3, Gemini. So there's going to be a lot of disruption of information, you know, whether it's people can't get access to their banking system, or we see big downs with technology. Obviously, the speed of growth of AI has proved rather alarming, so we're probably going to see a lot more conversation about governance, some kind of framework which makes us feel a little more secure. But whether it actually comes to anything within this 20-week period, I think is actually quite unlikely. I think the briefing that goes on between different factions, polarized factions in society, politically particularly, is going to be absolutely at full pelt. If anyone could imagine it could be any worse than it has over the last few years, well, I think that this event could see it being more intense. But what Saturn can do in a positive way is actually bring to account, because remember, Saturn's about experience, it's about knowledge, and it is in some ways about the better parts of traditionality. You know, tradition isn't always about power in a negative way. Sometimes it is about wisdom. So wisdom can be applied to information that's shared in a toxic way. So we've got Neptune's compromised by the Sun, Saturn's compromising Mercury. We also have Jupiter, the co-regent of the sign of Pisces, actually in a really good angle to Saturn, and it's in house 2. So it's asking us to be mindful of our resources, but also our past experiences, because of Saturn being in house 12. Remember, Pisces is about culmination. So all that experience we've gained, perhaps we can develop a new pragmatism to resources and be a bit thriftier. Then we need to look at the sign of Capricorn, where, of course, Pluto is, and that's in a quincunx with the Sun. So that's an aspect that can rip people from power that have not used that power wisely. So I think we're going to see some big news stories right through to the 4th of November. More and more information that's been kept out of sight. Pisces, 12th house, will come into the open. Now I just want to share very briefly the event chart in terms of Placidus based on Universal Central Time. This event actually begins at 5:27 and 5 seconds on the 17th of June, and Saturn conversely is in the 3rd house and Mercury is in house 7 open enemies, but relationships. And then the sun is in the 8th house of very deep commitments, where we're most invested, but also to do with transitions, and it can be to do with long-term financial assets, investments, stocks and shares, savings, insurances, property matters, and that's in a square with Neptune in house 4. So I don't think that looks great for the property market, but we all know the property market is pretty broken in lots of different parts of the world, because the price of rentals is horrendous. It's not just people who are buying properties being hit by a higher rate of interest charges on their mortgages. It's also that the people they rent from maybe are having to service higher borrowings as well. So it's having an impact on everybody. Now, the one big aspect that's going to occur through this journey actually happens at the end of August for 1 week within 3 degrees, but it becomes exact on the 27th of August. And this is particularly significant because the sun at that point is in the sign of Virgo and Saturn is in the sign of Pisces. Virgo is very much to do with the physical realm, and Pisces is very much to do with the psychological realm. So I feel that there could be some public health issues that come into the open in the last week of August. Now, we all are really hoping that there's not going to be some other big outbreak of a new strain of COVID, but it's still out there. And of course we know, because of the stories that are emanating about how the virus actually evolved in the first place, are not very encouraging in terms of what biolabs were involved or whatever else. It may not be that COVID's the only thing that we're dealing with, but in terms of public health, I think we all need to be aware in the last week of August of really looking after ourselves, both in terms of our physical well-being, but also our emotional state too. So that gives you a little bit of a flavour of what I feel that we can do to work with Saturn in Pisces. And Pisces is a very, very complex sign, and of course the first 10 degrees has that double Neptunian influence, so like a swirling mist, very hard to get a fix on where we are, and Saturn wants us to have a fix on where we are. So I feel that if we feel overwhelmed, Neptune, and that's draining to our structure of our routines, Saturn, that could see us feeling quite run down. So I think it's very important between now and the 4th of November, and to be honest, right through Saturn's journey through Pisces, to work much harder at understanding not just what makes ourselves tick, but also what makes other people tick as well. And in that sense, the cool detachment of Saturn can be rather useful, because it can help us to be a little bit less reactive, over emotional, hypersensitive, which is all possible with Piscean energy. So Saturn asks us to cool things down, and any extra rationality we can show can be a good thing as long as we're prepared to actually work, Saturn, apply ourselves, show application, all Saturn, to the parts of our lives that perhaps we want to look at the least, or we're least aware of. So I think that there can be some situations where someone could be making us more conscious that our approach could be triggering a response which is not necessarily very comfortable, and those are the lessons, Saturn, that we can learn. But I think we need to be aware that Saturn can be the bringer of knowledge, wisdom, experience, steadfastness. Old experiences can be used in a new format, continually evolving. The lovely thing about Pisces energy is that shifting, misty, new movement is very, very good for us in some ways, as long as we don't let it get away from us, that we keep some boundaries there. So Saturn can be very useful. And if you think back since 2012, the question I would ask, have we become much more dependent on prescribed medicines or even escapism through different types of intoxicants? Has that become more prevalent since 2012? Please share your thoughts on that. I'm not being prescriptive, but it does seem to me that we do have an appetite for escapism, because in some ways the pain of Saturn, in other words, working very hard in perhaps soulless jobs in order to bring home the money where we don't feel very invested in, and this is where Pisces energy can heal Saturn. That means that to deal with that reality, that harsh, stark, cold reality, that sometimes we do things that gives us some kind of relief. Now, in a positive way, that could be going on holiday, swimming, very Piscean, going to a spa day, very Piscean, having some lovely healing, meditative treatments, very Piscean. So Pisces energy can be very uplifting. It doesn't have to be just a negative dimension, because Saturn, like Pisces, like the retrograde, which is slowing things down and asking us to review and look at where we can improve our approach. All of these influences have an upper side and a lower side, and if we can reach into the upper side, that's the faith that the co-ruler of Pisces, Jupiter, brings to the equation, then we can evolve our philosophies to deal with this retrograde and actually emerge from it wiser, more grounded, more in touch with our emotional well-being and health, but not totally obsessed with the more material achievement of Saturn, and we can actually gain from this. So see it as an opportunity. Now, I'm going to go through each of the 12 zodiac signs from now, but what I would say is that if you are a mutable zodiac sign, so Pisces, Gemini, Virgo or Sagittarius, and you have planets in your nativity from 0 to 8 degrees, this event is going to have a particular impact upon you. But you may not be a mutable sun sign, but you may have other planets distributed around your wheel which will be affected by Saturn. Now, if you don't know your natal chart, please seize the opportunity to dive into a vat of a huge amount of personal knowledge and give me 3 pieces of birth data, of time, date and place of birth, and I can produce for you your life roadmap report. This will give you incredibly intimate knowledge to the patterns that have played out in your life, so you can work with them much more successfully. And also my special package of 30% off, you can get your 12-month personal, totally unique to you forecast, which will give you searing insights for the months ahead. If you don't know your time, I've realised that a lot of people don't, and I've never wanted to sell noon charts because that creates an ascendant that may be completely different to the person's reality. So I've created a new chart which doesn't include an ascendant, and it's based on the sun. It's a solar chart, and it's the life roadmap, like the natal life roadmap, and also the 12-month forecast, also 30% off. Please see the link beneath this video for more on that. But please stay with me for each of your 12 zodiac signs from Aries through to Pisces. Now, Aries, I've been saying since I did your prediction for 2023 in August last year that this year would be a year when some parts of your existence that have been a major central theme for a long time would come to an end. Now, whether it's a relationship, an interest, a hobby, a job, a tie with a family member, something will have come or is about to come to a shuddering end. And that feels really quite scary, I would imagine. But I also reassured you in my forecast that with the North Node, the true North Node arriving in your sign in July on the 17th, and the 2 lunations that you had, the first the new moon, the second the solar eclipse, although they were strongly influenced by Pluto and Jupiter, they gave you a chance to reinvigorate your life in a fresh way. So I feel that what Saturn's going to do through to the 4th of November could be to see you grieve for what's coming to an end, but also it's preparing the way, if that is evolving for you, to free you up to go forwards in a truly dynamic way. Now that will become fantastically obvious from 2025 when Saturn moves into your sign. So if you're someone who's been very much a person who's lived in the moment, had lots of lively fun times, always been on the front foot instigating things, a prime mover, but you've not really given yourself a lot of permission to explore what makes you tick, your shadow side, Saturn is kind of forcing your hand. And that's what you're going to be on through till the 4th of November, a bit of a crash course in understanding the deeper machinations of how you work, but how other people work. Now, if you're someone who's very much into personal development, you know all of that, and this is just the time when the hard work that you've done over a long period of time, you can just actually see just what knowledge you've garnered. And it's important that you salute yourself for that knowledge that you've garnered, and you could actually play quite the role in supporting or encouraging others, whether you work as a therapist, whether you're a counsellor, whether you're someone who's just really kind and supportive to people in your circle. So knowledge is the key. If you've got it, you're going to use it to help others. If it's something that perhaps you haven't had too much time for up until now, your whole mindset and outlook are going to change in a big way through to the 4th of November. So Taurus, we all have a long-term direction of travel. And for a lot of people, it can be quite a material journey. You know, we want to get a particular job, a particular car. We want to visit a particular place that has spectacular views, which will be an incredibly vivid experience. But those tick lists are actually really quite goal orientated. What are the things that are more to do with our higher purpose, that really are very gratifying? Do you know, one of the things that's very interesting, I feel, about life is that when we do set out to achieve a particular aim, when we get very close to it, or we've actually cracked it, we're not always quite as gratified as we thought we might have been at the start of that journey, because as we're approaching or getting to that point, we've actually evolved. And so we get that degree, or we get that big pay rise, or we have that job, but then we realise that there's something else that we want to attain. And that's what the 11th house is like. It's much more aspirational in an inspirational way than the 10th house, which is very much about concrete, solid areas of life, you know, like having a solid base, a well-structured existence. And of course, because you have a particularly strong appreciation of security, going for the more inspirational route is not always easy if it means giving up something that's worked very well for us. So the big question you're going to be asking yourself through the next 20 weeks is, are you heading towards that place of higher purpose or not? If you're not, and you're much more bound up with the more material achievements, I feel that you could be quite surprised that some of the things that you think are important could actually start to lose a little bit of appeal. Now, the other thing about the 11th house, where Saturn starts this retrograde, is it's not just about our longer term plan or a higher purpose, it's also about our connections to others and our network. And ever since March the 7th, I think those connections and affiliations have started to shift, and they're going to continue to shift, Taurus, for you right through to when Saturn moves into Aries in 2025, because what Saturn does is make us take things much more seriously. So therefore we don't give away our affections or our connections to others in quite a frivolous manner. And of course, Pisces energy can be so imperceptible, it can be a bit boundaryless. So what Saturn does is makes us more starkly aware of where it needs to be more of a black and white situation. We can't take such a nebulous approach. So I think essentially there's going to be a little bit of a clearing out around your friendship group, and you're going to want to spend the time with the people who are the really solid citizens. They may not necessarily be the funniest or the best off or the people who are the most successful. They're the people who you can absolutely totally count upon. And that's where you are, and that's the journey that's going to intensify through to the 4th of November. Gemini, because as this event begins, your ruler and the Sun are compromised in turn by Saturn with Mercury and Neptune on the Sun, I really feel that the experience for you could at times, especially in terms of your worldly interactions, be quite draining over the next 20 weeks, unless you do something that really is very uplifting to you. It's not just something, because you're such a smart communicator and you can flex and you can pivot on a sixpence and be very amusing, very witty and very alert. That alertness, wit and knowledge and way of exchanging information needs to be meaningful. If it's not meaningful and utterly sincere, some parts of the way you've been over quite some time could get scrutinized a lot more. That could get scrutinized by a boss, someone in your family, a partner, friends. But it's almost like people are starting to hold you to a much higher standard when it comes to ethics. And that's because Neptune and Saturn applying to the Sun and Mercury are not going to let you mesmerize people with your brilliance in quite as straightforward a way. So in other words, whereas you can very often create a way of being that people can't quite keep up with, I think you're going to find that if you are taking any shortcuts, you're not quite imparting information in quite the way you could do. You're not necessarily tuning into your higher self. You're more protective of your reputation of being smart. Then that could be something that will prove to be quite the lesson over the next 20 weeks. So sincerity around all communications is important. Your physical vitality is going to be affected a lot by work and professional demands. So if you can throttle back and just focus your energies into the areas that are really important, I think that is essential. So Cancer, the sign of Pisces, shares your water tropicity, so it's very much something that you have a natural appreciation for. Also, Jupiter, the traditional ruler of the sign of Pisces, is exalted in your sign, so there's a kinship there for sure. And the 9th house, as it is from your Sun in the sign of Cancer, is very much to do with knowledge, higher education, can be to do with travel, borders, international matters, contracts, and Saturn obviously can be difficult. It can inhibit us, it can slow things down. So the retrograde would suggest that if you're grappling with any kind of legal matter, the chances are it won't necessarily go forwards at quite the speed you would like. And it's also important to understand that the detail of whatever you're working with needs to be scrutinized to make sure it is truly accurate. And the reason for that is the Sun and Mercury are in your house 12. That's going to amplify your sensitivities, but it's also where you can feel most vulnerable and also at times, to be honest, betrayed. So in traditional astrology, house 12 is very much about secret enemies, but house 9 is about amplification. We don't tend to think about Saturn as being amplification, that's more limitation. But in the 9th house, it will amplify the attention and scrutiny on yourself, as will Neptune in its angle to the Sun on this event. So I think what you could expect over the next 20 weeks is at times things can seem rather overwhelming. Now, I'm sorry if this sounds a little bit blunt, but I don't feel that if I just say everything's going to be great, everything's going to be great, and then it isn't, I just think it erodes the reputation of astrology, and it would erode my reputation. And whilst there may be some that work in that way, working on massaging the feel-good factor, let's be honest, Saturn is not a bunch of laughs. So let's be real. So the reality here is that if there's anything that, you know, is a bit awkward in your backstory, particularly I think maybe to do with neighbours or siblings, because Mercury governs, and Gemini very much governs those things, or to do with knowledge that you've gained, I think expect greater scrutiny over this next 20 weeks. But also, if you're wanting to expand the paradigm when it comes to your consciousness and anything to do with healing, this is an enormous opportunity for the next 38% of the year. Now, Leo, for you, Saturn and Neptune are in house 8. This is where we're most devoted, it's where we're most invested, it's where we share things, it can be where we evolve, it can be where we go through metamorphosis, rejuvenation, but equally it's where things can come to an end. So what I would say with Saturn in the 8th house, for all Leo people, make contingencies for your future. So that is, don't necessarily just live it in the moment, which is very Gemini, buzzy, friendly, you know, interactive, very social. You need to be aware of the psychological politics that goes with that sociability. So for example, if you have dependents that would be affected a lot if you weren't with us any longer, I think you're knowing what I'm saying. Saturn, 8th house, make plans to put things in place to protect people once you're not here. Difficult topic, we've gone through it ourselves. It's not an easy conversation. But once those things are done, you forget about them, dust just gathers on them, but they're all in place, so contingencies have been made. Now Neptune, of course, is in the ruler of the sign of Pisces, is in a square with the Sun in house 8. So your longer term plan, house 11, may be afflicted, Saturn, by financial limitations or constraints, particularly around shared resources. So if you're in a business alliance, it could be affected by the current financial headwinds. It may be that it's more matrimonial, that one of you's job changes and it has a material effect on you both. So just be conscious of that. But there are also opportunities. So for example, if you've long wanted to be an entrepreneur for yourself, but the safety of working for a bigger organisation, Saturn, has always called out to you, it may be because the world is changing at such a pace that actually you're forced to think again and think afresh. And that's where the creativity of the sign of Gemini, where the Sun and Mercury are, can really be great assets to you. So thinking outside the box, but thinking very seriously about your long-term finances is one part of the practical side of this. In terms of the more emotional side, if you're someone who finds it difficult to be intimate or give up your own space, you're someone who's looking for that elusive, really devoted relationship, remember, Saturn can bring rewards, much more so than people think, much more so than some people think Jupiter brings, but only when we really do the work. So if you've got inner blockages that are preventing you from letting yourself get close, then Saturn's asking you, not just through the next 20 weeks, but in its time in Pisces, to really keep working away at that. Now, Virgo, for you, Saturn is of course in your sector of relating, and with Venus and Mars in your 12th house, there is absolutely no doubt, if you have a weak relationship in your life, particularly in that last week of August, when the Sun in your sign goes opposite Saturn, it could be teased out into the open, and you may really have to look at it. The 7th house can also be our open enemies, so that's our competitors, the people who we know don't like us very much, but we kind of have to deal with them, you know, maybe in our local community or organisation. So it could be that someone you're needing to interact with has a bit more of an oppressive impact on you because of Saturn's retrograde. But also remember that Neptune's in your 7th house as well, which can bring some real mysticism to the piece, and it may have enchanted you around at least one relationship since 2012. So the challenge is because the Sun and Mercury are in house 10, your professional world, it could be those relationships more than your personal ones, which will require some care over the next 20 weeks, because maybe you're going to become much more conscious of who has higher expectations of what you contribute and do. Libra. Saturn for you is in house 6, and therefore it's in house 6 for my good self too, in terms of whole sign astrology, and my ascendant at 23 degrees Libra. But Saturn is therefore forging a quincunx with the sign of Libra. So ever since 2012, I feel that the load that Neptune has given Libran people is a lot of development around your compassion, your awareness of looking out for those who are less fortunate. But because Pluto has been in house 4 for all but 11 weeks of that time, it's not necessarily been very easy. You know, a lot of give and a sense of not a lot of get. And then Saturn in the 6th house, the obvious implication is you've got to look after your physical well-being more. That means watching out for a particular Libran liking for sugar because of the Venusian rulership. Anything that's sweet and yummy, if you're anything like me, find it very hard to resist. But I am trying a bit harder, particularly with that after dinner ice cream. But seriously, Saturn in the 6th house could mean that a job situation has changed, not necessarily quite as satisfying, more demands, more responsibility, more criticism. 6th house, pointy, very Virgoan. So just be aware in that last week of August that I feel that you could be at a little bit of a low ebb. So if you can take some time off, have some moments of complete peace and relaxation through that week in particular, I would really do so. But Saturn in the 6th house is also, the 6th house is about purity. And remember that the sign of Pisces is water. So drink more water, try and get the toxins out. You know, if you are into massage, one of the great things with that is, of course, the lymph glands get, you know, a skilled masseuse or masseur will push those toxins out. And of course, because we use a lot of chemistries these days in terms of personal hygiene, they can actually be a sheen and a shield to, you know, our bodily functions working quite as efficiently as they could. So if you can strip down your approach to how you look after yourself and make it a bit more rugged, I think actually will be a good thing. I'm not suggesting you should go cold water swimming down here in West Wales, which I can imagine would be extremely cold, but you could definitely go swimming. You could definitely go for a good walk, because I think Libran people, and I definitely share this, when there isn't something engaging our minds, there can be a tendency to be a little bit sedentary, a little bit can't quite find the spark. So Saturn in a retrograde can actually push that. But what about those two influences in Gemini, your sister air sign? ninth house, sixth house. Well, I think if you feel that your goodwill and good nature are being abused, I think that you need to push back over these next 20 weeks. Scorpio. Saturn for you in Pisces is house 5. House 5 is the house of joys. We don't normally associate Saturn with house 5, do we? It's not a mutually inclusive thought that we might have. But you know, the people who make the most of their joyful talents, creators, artists, actors, performers, singers and so on, are the ones who work the hardest at it. You know, so having a Saturnian approach to talent is something we should be conscious of. So the more we practice Saturn, the more we rehearse Saturn, the better it is. And love relationships, house 5, marriage, is no different at all. But if your marriage isn't quite where you'd like it to be, and with Uranus in the 7th house along with Jupiter, you're thinking more about escapism rather than application, well, before you do march to the door marked exit because you really feel you're done, I think Saturn's going to really ask you some searching questions over the next 20 weeks to make sure that you've really scrutinized the situation, and most of all scrutinize your own approach to make sure that it's not just all about feeling that someone else doesn't get you. Where could you work at understanding them more deeply? And because the Sun and Mercury in house 8, devotion, I do get that if someone's being very possessive or jealous and that's getting you down, that's not attractive behavior. But what about your own responses? Are you manifesting any of those emotions? It's said that Scorpios can have those more negative ways of being. Is that true of you? I don't know. Only you can answer that question. Now that brings us to Sagittarius. Saturn in house 4 is really interesting because I think one of the areas that Sagittarius people resist is looking too much in the dark, if you like, of the emotion, because the Jupiterian energy you have, and obviously it's wonderful that Jupiter applies to this event in a very constructive way, which could mean some positive changes around where you live, but also getting more organised around where you live. But if you are someone who does really have a reluctance for looking at your emotions, your feelings, then you're in for an intense crash course the next 20 weeks to try to submit to the process. And it's not going to end there, because Saturn will go forwards and you're still going to have to do it right through to 25 when Saturn moves into your sister fire sign of Aries. So for Sagittarius, it's about applying to the emotional sphere and not feeling that that's something you're unprepared to do, because it's just better to think, look, that didn't work out, dust yourself off, move on to the next exciting adventure, but meanwhile accumulating more and more slightly unresolved bits of debris, which then can build up and then create an impact on your daily reality. So, you know, I have Sagittarius energy, so I have Mars and Saturn in the sign of Sagittarius, so I kind of get it. And it is always good to be very much on the front foot and dynamic, and you're not going to stop being dynamic, but you're also being asked perhaps to think about, if you've been very much a free spirit, what would you gain from family life, from a very secure home, from having an existence that had a degree of structure to it, from having an addition to your family, maybe settling down with one partner for the longer term, even if you've been someone who's been an Olympic standard backpacker. You could find yourself thinking much more seriously about the roots of your existence during this transition. Capricorn, of course, Saturn is your glorious ruler. You understand it. You get that it's all about hard work, application and perspiration. But in the 3rd house, it's about how you think, and it's about your immediate connections with people around you, neighbours, siblings, your use of technology, your ideas and how you express them, the mode of expression. Saturn can make you a bit reticent or cool at times, and in the third house that could be scrutinized more. With the Sun and also Mercury in house 6, it could be at work where there's more friction if you're not communicating with people in quite the way they expect. House 6 demands sacrifice. House 3 is very nimble. Of course, Saturn's much more slow in a much more considered energy. So if you're someone who has been a little bit flippant in some of your responses, or hasn't been quite as attuned to other people's belief systems or other people's experiences, Saturn in its retrograde is asking you to consider those things. And with the Sun and Mercury in house 6 applying to Saturn and Neptune, you can't really find it, you won't find it easy, I don't feel, to achieve everything you want on your own terms. There's going to have to be some sacrifice. House 6, Pisces energy. Aquarius. Saturn in a retrograde in the second house continues a story that began on March the 7th of asking you to be much more in touch with your core values, second house, self-worth, second house, everyday money, second house. You have that Saturnian side to your nature, but if you're born later in Aquarius, for example, the last 10 degrees, that means your sub-decan is Venusian. Therefore, you could have a real appreciation of splashing money out. If you're in the second decan, it's very much about ideas with you, modes of transport. You know, if you really like your lovely car, you could well be in the second decan of Aquarius. If you're in the first decan, you probably really get this Saturnian energy because you've almost certainly always been someone who's been very hard working, but also very progressive, because it's the combination of Saturn and Uranus. So I would say that Saturn going retrograde means that finances could be squeezed a little bit more tightly, but also your potential to be shrewder and better judging your expenditure is going to be accentuated. So your wisdom you can learn a lot about the Earth's resources, about, if you're someone who's very much an environmentalist, you're going to feel very passionate during this transition, as you will do through Saturn's journey right the way through Pisces, but it will get stronger. I think the fifth house energy in Gemini is about gambling, risk, living in the moment, being much more frivolous, having fun. So I would say Saturn and Neptune interacting with those two positions is saying to you, do not speculate on things that you can't really afford to lose on. So I would go safety first on resources, but also a respect and appreciation for the beliefs and value systems you have. But also Saturn can be, it can be a little bit censorious, it can lecture a little bit. Your values won't necessarily, of course, mesh with other people's. So there may be times when it really frustrates you how frivolous other people are with theirs, how material they are. It could be it works like that for you, it just depends. But also, of course, the second house can be about the good things in life. So this would be a good time to double down on any kind of sensible diet plan. Eat better food, more natural food, cook it from scratch. That's all where Saturn in its retrograde can really help you. Which brings us to Pisces, and of course for you, particularly if your birthday is in the first 10 degrees of the sign of Pisces, or you have any other natal planets in that part of your chart, you are really going to feel, I think, that your vitality is lower. And there's no getting around this. Essentially, you can have a Saturn return when Saturn gets back to where it was when we were born, but we also have the Saturn conjunct the Sun return, which if you're in the first 8 days of the sign of Pisces, you're really going to be feeling this. And, it may feel that you don't have much vitality at all. And anything to do with home, emotion, family, if you're living in not the greatest accommodation, it really could feel very oppressive. So what can we gain from this? Well, Saturn just asks us to double down on the discipline. Even when it's really, really hard, find the grit and determination, Saturn, in order to negotiate the challenges that you're experiencing. And I actually feel that what's going to happen is that you're going to declutter your life of pursuits, interests, people, roles that just no longer work for you, because you have to simplify it right down to the thin strand that's absolutely essential, and use the available energy you do have on those things or those interests or those people or that job which really means a lot to you. But I think there could be some extra demands through your family or emotional life which can feel a little bit overburdensome at times, but actually you can grow in your strength, your vigor to deal with life's challenges, because life isn't always without some bumps in the road. So I think this can make you stronger, and that's really what I feel that Saturn will do, particularly if you're born early in the sign. Now, if you're born later in the sign, Saturn can be affecting your emotional and spiritual situation quite a lot, and you could find yourself worrying about stuff. And if you do feel that anxiety is becoming a little bit sort of more bedded in, you know, I've experienced it a lot in my life, to be honest, and it's a really horrible thing, because once the genie gets out the bottle, it's very hard to put it back in there again. But what Saturn can also represent is wisdom. So if you talk to people or find sources of information on the internet to better inform yourself, whether it is to do with some nutrients that you could improve upon, some exercise, some ways of thinking slightly differently. So the knowledge factor of Saturn is visited in your situation in a way which is very uplifting and helpful to you. It's been a real pleasure being with you. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to check out my special offer below, but please do like, comment or subscribe.